don't believe that the God of the Old Testament is the God of Christianity. And this is actually a very old idea that has been lost to history. But from my perspective, the energy that was brought by the gospel of Jesus was co-opted, leveraged, harnessed by many of the powers at the time. And so, when I look at the Bible, which I believe is a very profound text for just a number of reasons, just from a historical perspective, but you have to burrow through it in order to find glimpses of Christianity, ironically. This is my opinion, of course. I can't really prove this, but the signs and the evidence is there. For instance, it was a very common, I'll get back to the God of the Old Testament in a minute, but let's talk about some real conventional, one would say very Christian ideas, like that have nothing to do with the Old Testament. Like the idea of Christ being born of a virgin. This notion of the man-God hybrid was a very common trope of lore of that time. Much of Greco-Roman mythology covers this extensively. There were several gods that would come down and impregnate human women and create demigods, like Hercules, for example. This, in fact, some of the most early depictions of Jesus resembled quite closely statues of Apollo. And my sense is that what was going on is the story of Jesus was being turned into a mythology by the people at the time who were already immersed in these sorts of ideas. And thus, gradually, the history and the gospel itself, in my opinion, became perverted, would be one way to put it. Others might think it was infused with the cultural perfumes of the time. It really depends on your perspective. But I think several ideas like this are really vestiges of ideas that belonged at the time but were being forgotten and let go of, and we were transitioning to just a whole new framework, a whole new state of mind, perspective. But it couldn't quite take root, and this is, I guess, what I want to express today is a lament that proper Christianity, in my opinion, was never really truly allowed to take root, other than in the soil of the time, which inevitably led to something that probably does not resemble very closely what Jesus intended. The God of the Old Testament is a very wrathful, jealous, petty God. A set of ideas and themes that tie very closely to the Jewish people. A people who, because of their nomadic ways and having to endure persecution constantly for hundreds and thousands of years, has created kind of a hardened personality, resilient, and perhaps a skeptical view of authority. The kinds of things that would cause naturally for a mythology of that sort to emerge. And so I think the Old Testament, to me, is a vestige of another time, of another culture, of another history. And furthermore, to me, how could it not be obvious that God would not be those things? How could one go on believing that God was that petty? Jesus, his gospel, stood in contrast to all of this, stood in contrast to the ideas of Judaism, the ideas of the Greco-Roman mythologies. My opinion, this is me looking at the crumbs and piecing together the puzzle as I believe it was. Okay? Things come together in a way that crystallizes everything and makes things make sense. You know, lately one of the things people talk a lot about is, what is this judeo-christian thing we always talk about, being judeo-christian? Well, what that is goes back thousands of years. From the very early time, I believe, when Rome decided to adopt Christianity as the state religion. And I think therein began the amalgamation of attempting to create this hybridized mythology that brought in the Roman tradition, that brought in the Jewish tradition, brought in this emerging, interesting group of Christians into one political umbrella. But that was not Christianity. Not at all. It may have been infused with Christianity, but it was not Christianity proper, in my opinion. How I came to this realization that God could not be this way as portrayed in the Old Testament is by looking at myself as a father, and at other fathers, and how they are with their own children, which by definition we must be far, far worse and far, far more petty than God, the Father of creation. There's no way any one of us could hold up to the standard of whatever it was that made us. And yet, if a child chooses to disobey me, I do not become wrathful and kick them out of my home. In fact, I still love them. And I give them another chance, and I try to teach them. I give them many chances, and I try to guide them through their missteps. Even if a child chooses to hate me and write me off, there is still in me a part that loves this child and really hopes that they will come back, or at the very least, that they will be okay without my guidance. This is me as a fallen father, a very imperfect Father. And you're telling me that the God that created us can't live up to my standard? You have to be kidding me. That is an insult and an offense to God. And this is why I believe that what Christianity has become over the last, 2,000 years is a perversion of what it was meant to be. And I'm curious what you think. If you've observed this, and what would I even call myself? What is this belief system? Does it have a place to call home? Truth is, according to Jesus, it was never really meant to. Upon this rock I shall build my church, is what Jesus said when pointing to Peter. Peter, the name itself meaning rock. And what he meant by that is that this is not a truth that will ever rest under the rooftop of an institution. This is a truth that can only live in your heart. So that is my message for you today. That is a pretty big elephant in the room, wouldn't you say? I'm curious to hear what you think. Thanks for watching.